headset, so I want to make sure it's coming through
No,
clear.
your audio is very, very good.
Okay,
Is mine all right? Because I'm just using the handset of the receiver.
It's good. It faded in and out a couple of times, but really, the handset is usually very good. Also, you're using a telephone, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's usually very good.
Cool.
And both of your volumes sound good.
Great.
Can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna we'll just try to mute ourselves whenever possible, and if I don't mute myself and I start typing and you hear this clicking, it'll be pretty apparent. You see where it says on the control panel, it says talking Gary Socolow?
Yeah.
Yeah, that will be what will, if I'm typing really loud and forgetting that it'll say talking Gary Socolow, and that's when you go, Gary, mute yourself. We can hear you typing. And really, and as we try to treat this pretty informally. If we make a mistake or if after a poll I'll forget to go back to the program.
Who does the slide changing?
Oh,
how does that work?
So it can work two ways. Basically, if you want me to change the slide, you just want to call next slide. We can do it that way, or I can give mouse control over to Katie. Either one works with me.
Yeah, whose computer screen are we looking? Oh, it's Michael Stafford's screen.
It's fine.
Yeah. Now, Michael, you know that if you do that, you can't touch your keyboard.
Right.
Yeah. Once you give them keyboard and mouse control, you need to keep your hands off.
Yeah.
And the rest of us will answer questions.
I'll make sure. Can you, if I give it over to you, Katie, can you see it?
Hey guys, this is Caitlin. I just want to let you know I was here.
Hey, Caitlin. Hey,
Hello.
Caitlin.
I mean, I am totally fine doing it, although it's not coming through right now. But I'm also fine if, just for ease, I totally understand if you don't want to hand it over. So
I can call out next slide because I'm just going to do the introductions. So, I mean, I'll just do the next slide. Yes.
You're doing the overview too?
No, just the introduction, right?
And I thought you were doing the tasks and the purpose.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. I'm going to do this, and then at the introduction, I'm going to be like, without further ado, I'll introduce Kathleen Rooney, our project consultant, project manager, who worked on doing the guidebook with us. Does that sound right? Yep. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
You can say whatever you want. I'll just.
Well, I always try to script it, and then I end up just saying, what comes natural. So, I do my best. I'm getting better as time goes on.
No, that's the best way to do it. Once you script it, it makes you comfortable to then go on your own.
Right.
So, Chris, can I tell you that's the first time I think I've seen a picture of you, so now I know what you look like, despite having worked with you for 2 years since we've never met.
I've got no picture anywhere. I'm not on the internet. Just a bunch of planning reports. Just a bunch of projects. That's all I'm known for. The mysterious project guy. Yeah, I had to just snap that selfie real quick here in the office. I did it I don't know, was that Monday or Tuesday?
Yeah,
oh my gosh, I should have a picture too, yeah. So.
Well, next time you're in D5, you need to visit her.
I am. We are soon. So.
Are you?
I'm looking forward. Yeah, I'll let you know.
I'll even come down that direction if you want me to. Provided.
Right. Well, I'll be in Orlando, on the 19th. Okay. And then we'll see each other
in June.
Was the first week of June, so
yeah.
All right.
I'm not as scary in person, I'm saying.
Okay, it is now time to actually get out of practice mode where we're in, and to actually start. So Michael, do you want me to get out of practice mode, or would you like to handle all of it?
I'll hit start.
Okay, great.
Okie dokie. We got a lot of people rolling in here. We are just about to get started. Gary, can you hear me? Good, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good to go.
I don't know why. It says that I'm muted.
That's Caitlin.
Oh, that's a different Gary Socolow. Okay, sorry about that.
Alrighty,
Hey,
so it is
Caitlin,
2:32.
you know how to change your name?
We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Transportation Site Impact and Access Management webinar series. Today we will be discussing the topic of using mobility fees to fund transit improvements. My name is Michael Stafford and I'll be your host today. I work in the Systems Planning Office under Gary Socolow. We have two guest speakers today, Chris Wigglesworth. He works in the FDOT Transit Office as a project manager, and we also have Kathleen Rooney, who works for Renaissance Planning as a project manager. We also have our usual Gina Bagnani, Gary Socolow, and then joining us today and the team is Keelan Davidson, and she will be working with us from now on. As of right now, everyone is muted to reduce any background noise. If you have any questions, though, please raise your hand in the control panel, and we will get to you. We would like to do it as a raise your hand and question and answer format throughout the webinar, so no need to wait till the end. If you have a question, just put your hand up and we'll unmute you. We'll be sending out a copy of the presentation along with all the materials at the end, probably a day or so after. And then if you're seeking CM credits, the AICP number will be sent to you when it becomes available. And yes, we are recording the webinar, so that link will also be sent in the follow-up email. Like usual, we like to do a poll to see who is on our webinars. Gary, you want to activate that for me?
Yes, I do. And we'd like to know who you represent. And as you answer it, I'll see how many. Very good. All right. A little bit longer. We'll get most people. All right. It's been about 40 seconds. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the poll, and then I'm going to share it with everybody. Now you see that between Florida DOT staff and consulting firms, we have most people, and we also have a number of local governments and quite a few people representing themselves. Earlier this, in setting up this webinar, I tried to make it that you can actually view, the people out there and the internet can view those who are attending, and I'm hoping that you can. So with that, I want to thank you for coming. There's around 30 people on, and do appreciate you being here. So we'll go on to the next poll. Okay, next poll is, are you in Florida? We'd like to know how many people here, how this word gets out, because this is a open to anybody, free to anybody, and we ask you to send out the registration to anybody you think would be interested in this. So Okay, I see here that we have a majority of people that have answered the question, and I will close it. And you'll see here it's about 3/4 of you who are in Florida, but about 25%, 28% are outside of Florida, and I really appreciate the interest from there. All right. Before we move on, I have okay.
Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, have people been hearing us? I sure hope so. If you can hear us now, and please raise your hand. Good.
Hey Gary,
Okay.
this is Chris. I've heard you all along.
Well, I think it's different for those of us that are people on the line. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to put all the hands down, and I was just going to ask you, is this the first time? Yeah, we now can know that you hear us, and I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you answering the questions, even though you didn't hear our discussions. So thank you. And since I got your attention here, and since the subject of this is public transportation and mobility fees, by a raise of hands, how many of you are land use transportation funding? Let's just say that it's a big part of your career, a big part of your job. If you would, you raise your hand. Okay, excellent. And I hope you can see that it's a good number of you that this is a subject of interest, and we really do appreciate it. All right, thank you. And that is the last. Well, I think that might be the last questions I ask you. This is Gary Socolow, so I will hand it over.
Sure.
All right.
And taking over now will be Chris Wigglesworth from the FDOT Transit Office. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Wigglesworth. I'm the FDOT project manager in the transit office for this project. You know, we wanted to look into using how mobility fees would work. That would help fund transit facilities and operations. The office wanted to investigate the opportunity to fund transit facilities and operations that mobility fees under the Community Planning Act allow for. Now that roadway concurrency is no longer mandated, the mobility fee allows for mitigation from the impacts of development through a multimodal approach, and you know the mobility fees under Chapter 163 allow for that. So to start off with, I'm Chris Wigglesworth, FDOT Project Manager, and with me today is Kathleen Rooney, Project Manager for Renaissance Planning, who's worked on this project with us. We've done extensive amount of study and research to come up with this book, and it's an overview of how mobility fees kind of work generally in Florida, and with a special emphasis on transit. Next slide. So the overview today will be the project context, the introduction, 5 phases of a mobility fee program, and a summary. And Kathleen will be the presenter explaining to us the project that she has and we have worked on. Next slide. The tasks of the project that or the foundations that we started off with was, first we convened a working group to all have input into the process and the progress of the guidebook. The working group included members of DOT, transit agencies around the state, cities, counties, and several consulting firms that also are a part of assisting local governments in writing their mobility fee ordinances. The research programs were statewide and nationally, and all this went into helping develop our guidebook. Next slide. The purpose of the guidebook was to develop a resource and best practices guide on mobility fees. And since this is kind of a new subject matter since the passage of the Community Planning Act in 2011, there wasn't a whole lot of background information on this, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do a guidebook on mobility fees. We wanted to help local governments at all the stages to think through the key considerations and questions about how you go about determining whether you have a mobility fee or need a mobility fee, consider various approaches and options, leverage notable practices that have occurred in other areas or other local governments, and learn about the specifics of certain programs. So the desired outcome, as you see on the slide, was to help local governments plan and develop a mobility fee program to fund transit and transit supportive investments. Next slide. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Kathleen Rooney, and she'll walk us through the guidebook.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to dive right in since you gave us a really good overview and sort of introduction to what we're doing. So right now I'm going to cover kind of the purpose, the history, and a little bit about what we found from the research, and then we'll dive into the guidebook and the 5 phases. Next slide. So just to make sure everyone sort of understands a little bit about the history of where the mobility fee comes from, it's a pretty it has a very short history. You start in the early 2000s, people understanding that concurrency isn't doing what they want it to do. You see a few legislative and rulemaking modifications, but really around 2009 is when the mobility fee starts to show up. There's 2 reports, one from Cutter on the concept, and then the joint report on mobility fee and methodology study come out. And really those are sort of the foundational documents about what a mobility fee is, what it could be, what does it mean, how does it differ, what are some of the options. And then, that's kind of where the concept gets rolling. And then in 2011, as Chris talked about, the requirements for transportation concurrency are removed, and this information gets put out about what's necessary to develop an alternative mobility funding system. And that same year, the first mobility fee is adopted. We have, again, in 2013, a few other things in terms of encouraging the adoption of mobility fees if local governments do repeal concurrency. But then by 2015, we've got more than 20 programs, and now in 2017, we've got about almost 30 programs. Chris and I kind of keep a running list, but I can't guarantee its accuracy at any given moment or that it's always complete, because sometimes these things happen and we don't always hear about them immediately. But as you can see, that's a pretty quick time frame for a new policy mechanism, and has really just flourished within the state in a lot of different ways. Next slide. Ooh. Is it going? There we go. But one of the sort of interesting things that with this project and with mobility fees in general is that the legislation itself doesn't actually tell you what a mobility fee is, what a mobility fee program is. And the 2 foundational documents that I sort of talked about, Cutter's report and the joint report, are really important. But as we discovered when we went through the research, we found things called mobility fee programs that didn't actually meet those same definitions. And obviously we are not the Florida legislature, and I don't want to put a definition out there, but we had to come up with something that was a common understanding of what a mobility fee program was in order to conduct the research. It's very difficult when it's a term only used really in Florida. To then look for national programs that might offer some really good advice and insight, but don't use that term. And if you can't, define it or sort of outline what it says, then that can be problematic. So we came up with that, broadly speaking, and it is very similar to the Cutter one, so I don't want you to think that we haven't necessarily done that, but it's not exact. Is a transportation system charge on development that allows local governments to assess the proportionate cost of transportation improvements needed to serve the demand generated by development projects, which can be a bit of a mouthful. And we have found that generally, if you just sort of regard it as an equation, it's much easier to understand, is that it's the additional transportation demand from development times the cost for transportation improvements to mitigate that development impact. Next. And there are some benefits to taking on mobility fees. One is that it does provide an alternative to concurrency. It allows greater flexibility in the use of collected funds, as Chris talked about. It's not exclusively for roadways. It can be used on a much wider diversity of transportation projects. From our purposes, it can fund transit supportive capital improvements and operations. It also promotes compact and mixed-use development, and it is supporting the development of new tools and techniques. And I'll talk about those in just a second. Next slide. But the one thing the legislation, the enabling legislation does kind of outline is that there are certain requirements that mobility fee programs have to cover. And, we sort of mentioned that this is the section 163.3180 that it needs to be consistent with, which really details a lot of requirements. What we've done here is kind of summarize them at a high level. So it can't be used mobility fee programs can't be used to deny, time, or phase an application. The revenue collected must be used to implement the needs of a local government plan. It has to comply with the rational nexus test. It cannot fund existing transportation deficiencies. And then, again, like I said, it has to be consistent with a lot of the sort of line-by-line elements of the enabling legislation. Is everyone familiar with rational nexus, or do I need to pull up the definition and explain that? I guess if you need to know, throw something in the chat box or raise your hand.
My recommendation, this is Gary Sokolow. Rational nexus is so important that I think a little bit of time spent with it would be good.
Sure. So the rational nexus test gets called a few things, particularly in the mobility. Sometimes it's called the dual rational nexus. Sometimes people refer to it as a three-pronged. So we chose to stick with rational nexus because either way we knew what we were discussing. But really is that it's two criteria that the law needs to meet. And I hope I get this exactly correct because sometimes it's very precise. But is that the need for the fee is based upon the amount of the growth impact, so that you can demonstrate that this fee is directly linked to actions that people are undertaking or an impact of a project explicitly, and that the money is then also spent to dealing with that particular impact. And that's common with fees and all sorts of different types of, notably with impact fees. That's a common test that needs to be met, and you have to demonstrate how you're meeting it in a lot of cases. Does that help? Does everyone, Gary, is that good? I feel like that's the short version. There's
that was short and quite accurate, more accurate than I would have been able to give. So.
Excellent. I know once you know what it is, you know it, but then you're not always great at explaining it, it turns out. So.
No,
and again, if there are other terms that are used that folks have questions about, please, don't hesitate to stop and ask. I do really try not to use acronyms, but I can't guarantee it. So next slide. So one of the things I alluded to earlier was that there's a whole host of new tools and techniques. And this is actually probably like the largest amount of information that shows up in the enabling legislation, and that they were really trying to spur new tools and techniques. And that cover long-term strategies to facilitate development patterns, to support multimodal solutions, area-wide levels of service standards, usually more of the multimodal nature, techniques around exempting impacts or reducing the fees associated with certain types of development, whether it be urban by, its context, in multimodal transportation districts, in redevelopment areas, just mixed-use development, or even affordable housing developments. And that also that there was this prioritization of trying to support a safe, attractive, comfortable pedestrian environment, but paying attention to the context so that it would have a convenient interconnection to transit. This is, I think it's funny, but if you go to the legislation, this is like the bulk of what it says about a mobility fee, other than some of the requirements. And I think what you sort of recognize as a result of the way the legislation is structured is that there's a lot going on in this topic because it's a little open-ended, and there's a lot of dynamic exploration happening in the state of Florida around this. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize what the guidebook and all our research activities, how we came to some of these conclusions and results, is that we did a state of the practice and we reviewed over 50 programs, including the active 20 plus that were in Florida, and then obviously another 20 some odd around the country, in about 10 to 12 states, I think, broadly speaking. The majority of what I would call analogous programs, so they would be considered, I would say, impact fees that have some sort of basically trying to reflect the location of where a development might be. So starting to add in some of these things, either where it's located in an urban environment and supporting compact development, or they were trying to get at more of a multimodal perspective rather than just a roadway fee. They get called a lot of different things statewide, nationwide, sorry. But the majority really end up being basically on your coastal states, and then the ones that really are more established and seem to be doing what they want to do, and you have more than one in an individual state, really is out west in California, Oregon, and Washington. And so we focused on some of the ones there, as you can see in below, where we started working on specific notable programs. In Florida, this includes Boca Raton, Broward County, Kissimmee, Ormond Beach, Pasco County, and Sarasota County. And then nationwide, again, Bellingham, Portland, Sacramento, San Francisco, and Seattle. Next slide. For those of you that just wanted to know where all the programs are, this map and list was current as of, I'd say, 2016, early 2016. You can see it's all over the state. There's, some places that haven't gone for it as much as others, but we have cities, we have counties, we have neighborhoods. So, varying different geographies, we have different parts of the states. The state are showing up, and you can also see that we have different terms for it. Some of them are mobility fees, but some of them that meet this standard are also called multimodal transportation impact fees still. Some are just out of like the multimodal transportation district, the MMTDs. So, and another interesting thing is not all of them have necessarily rescinded their concurrency, which, so you see different versions of that as well. Next slide. So when you start to dive into all these different programs, is that there's some categories of distinguishing features that really sort of determine how these programs look really different on the ground. And these include basically how do you build up the fee? The first one being like, what's the cost basis? So how do you determine the financial impacts of the development? What does that mean? If it's a roadway, how does that translate into money? And if it's a multimodal, what does that mean as well? The trip basis of fee, how do you start to account for the trip? Is it an ends-based system or is it a length-based system? And we'll get into some of these details a bit more. And then how the money is spent, the disposition of expenditures. What do they get to be used on? What types of projects? Where? Those types of things. And then how they deal with credits and discounts. What project elements or even program design elements reduce the cost of fees. But what I think is really kind of critically important about taking away from this broad brush is that no two mobility fee programs are really the same. You just start to see a lot of different variability across the programs. There are some that look more like others, but it's not guaranteed. And even if they were alike on 3 of these features, the 4th one might be totally different. And so to keep that in mind, that the framework we developed, the 5 steps, really does work well in that everyone walks through these steps, but there are a lot of individual choices, and they're not necessarily interdependent upon one another. So, next slide. So this, I'm going to walk through a few slides that kind of give a broad brush of like how many programs did what types of things. So these are out of 22 programs total, which is when we calculated these numbers and developed this information. So, 21 out of 22 use the funds towards transit supportive uses. And when we talk about transit supportive uses, we're talking about sort of bike ped infrastructure connecting to transit. But still very high, 20 of them use it towards transit capital investments. So, it's really being used to sort of support multimodal options across the state. Next slide. It drops down when you're talking about transit operations. Only about 8 programs at the time really were able to figure it out. And obviously for us and our interest, that was kind of like the holy grail, was to finding those that could figure out how to do it. So there's enough that there are examples. That being said, some of that really comes down to, I think, an ease of implementation question where, the mobility fee itself is a one-time fee, whereas transit operations are an ongoing expense every year. And I think for some particularly smaller jurisdictions and for other programs, it's just hard to get those things to match, and it's a higher level of complexity. And so if you can, folks like to get there, but I think for some folks it's just a big stretch, and you can kind of see how like that disconnect between every year and a one-time fee can make that a little bit more challenging. So it doesn't really surprise us that there aren't more that are undertaking it that way. Next slide. Only 4 programs automatically take the fee money and put it into a transit dedicated account. We actually thought that would be higher given sort of how many of them cover transit capital, but it doesn't work out that way. Most of them end up going into other types of funds. Next. So back to when we were talking about the cost fee, how you choose to build that up. Historically, and pre-mobility fee, it would just be on the roadway. So we've got about half of the programs include transit capital in the cost basis of the fee, whereas only 5 actually included in the cost transit operations in the cost basis of the fee. So it drops down again once you have to sort of deal with the operational assessments. Next. Over half, have a really explicit planned projects list for which the fee will go to. But in some cases, we had a few programs that really talked about it being needed for unfunded needs. So those projects that over time they couldn't necessarily find the locations for, couldn't find the fundings for. Sorry. Next slide. About half base the trips on vehicles miles traveled or person miles traveled. And the next most common way that people base their trips on is on the number of trips. Next. And then you see we got about 5 programs that apply discounts for design elements, and these might be things like if it's a mixed-use development. And then others apply credits for gas taxes and other revenues, and that's in most cases to comply with rational nexus, but is very much a jurisdictionally specific decision that, in order to make the program work from that perspective. Next slide. So just some other, key findings that aren't about some of the distinguishing features is that, working through this, we did kind of come up with a common understanding. I shouldn't use the term definition, but a common understanding of what a mobility fee program is, what it likes to achieve, generally where communities are going with them, and to a certain degree, what's the ideal program. We obviously had that coming from like the transit perspective. But we do understand is that there's really a lot of diverse practices. You can kind of see that outside of paying for transit capital and transit supportive improvements, none of the other sort of different types of features really get past more than half the programs, which means that there's another half of the programs out there that don't actually take that same approach. It really comes down to like what the drivers are and the rationales for your program, and that really, getting that right really sets the stage for what types of decisions and what path you might want to take for your mobility fee, and that there's a lot of varied methodologies. We highlighted some of the ones that kind of made it to the top just to give a broad understanding, but there are other ways of doing it, and I sort of anticipate that more potentially might come online in the next few years. But we did come up with a common framework of 5 phases that we did vet with people who developed programs, and they were pretty pleased, I'd say, overall, and felt that like what we were describing really reflected the process they went through, even if that's not the way they would have described it themselves or documented it, and that we do have a set of best practices. There's one sort of caveat about the best practices, recognizing that the oldest program is only 6 years old. A lot of these don't have projects on the ground, so it's hard to know how well they're meeting community objectives at this point in time, and it's really just a function of time. I would anticipate within like 5 years we would be able to say more definitively about some of these best practices. But, these are the ones that seem to rise to the top based upon what we've learned to date, but, it's hard to demonstrate them or prove them at this point in time. Next slide. So now we dive into the 5 phases of a mobility fee program, and this is where that sort of resource guide comes into. Next slide. In that, we were really tasked with two elements. One is to the resource guide so that you can walk through and really know how to develop a program on your own, but then also best practices to help people make, better decisions or learn from what other experiences communities have gone through. And so the guidebook covers these 5, and it goes, from pre-planning, which is, do we want to do a mobility fee? Will it help us? To planning, okay, we're going to do a mobility fee. Now what's it going to look like? Like, what do we want to achieve? To the methodology and computations, which is, how are we going to start assessing fees? What does it look like when you start talking real development projects? And then, okay, now we have to talk to the developers and get the money from the impact fees. Where does it go? How do we deal with that? And then the last thing is, how do we fund the projects and know that the program's working? And each phase has key questions and then a spotlight case study in which we explain the program, but then also highlight how this particular example dealt with that particular phase. And then the last part of the guidebook summarizes some key best practices and also provides an implementation checklist, which we'll show at the end. But that really is meant to kind of put all of the key questions from the phases in one place so that if you were working on this on your own, you could kind of refer to it and make sure you're asking and answering all the right questions. Next slide. So the first phase, pre-planning, is why implement a mobility fee? Many communities, they have different reasons. None of these are necessarily mutually exclusive, but not all of them apply to every program. So in some cases, it was to support compact development. In other cases, it was really just wanting more transportation funding flexibility. For other communities, it was wanting to have more transportation funding, additional revenue. For others, it was really just trying to explore alternatives to concurrency. And then the last one, which is sort of a subset of the transportation funding ones, but is really wanting to increase funding for transit. And, again, like you could pick 3 of these, and then that might help you figure out what way you want to move forward in the next phase. But one of the big best practices that we determined is that really getting a handle on what your program goal is helps make those decisions easier. There are certain options that if you don't, if supporting compact development is not as much of something you want to do, then other types of decisions as you start to develop your fee make sense. But for people who do want to do that, you end up going in certain directions. Some of this is also a function of geography. The decision that's correct for a county may not be the same as if you're only doing it for a small neighborhood area. Next slide. Another big question is it feasible? I would say just when we dove into a lot of the programs, there are also examples of programs that never made it. And that is usually around, I would say, political feasibility, particularly around the recession time or the outfall from the recession and people not wanting to necessarily change their impact fee regimes at those point in times. But it's an important question. And, some of it depends on what transportation funding sources are you already receiving? How does that work? Understanding the political feasibility. Another one is really being able to analyze and establish the basis for your rational nexus. How are you going to do that so that you feel very comfortable moving ahead? I would say doing that actually is a really, really important consideration. In talking to folks in both the interviews and then also with our working group, people were very nervous around this topic in that not knowing how they could do it, what would be okay, what was needed, and those sorts of things. So really trying to figure it out because it is a very much a jurisdictional by jurisdictional decision, although obviously there are larger, practices across the state that can help. And then the last one is determining the project types to include in the program, just at a high level. Like, is it going to include transit, to what extent, and how? Next slide. So with Sarasota, their best practice was really that they spent a lot of time on this topic, on this phase, and that they spent about 2 to 3 years maybe in this phase and into the next phase. But they worked with the stakeholders in the public outreach, campaign, and education that really focused on what a mobility fee is, what it could fund, and what it would cost, and kind of almost worked through this decision phase with the community in some ways. But it was really, at the end of the day, supporting the community goals of developing a complete street network. And that kind of upfront commitment, I think, served them really well. This particular program hasn't had as many maybe implementation hiccups as some of the other ones we've seen across the state. And a note about these spotlight case studies, I'm going to sort of focus on the best practice on the bottom, but one of the things that we did provide, and I wanted to make available for everyone here, is this program profile, so you can kind of at a glance see how some of the expenditures, what they're being spent on, some of the distinguishing characteristics. Is it based on VMT or trips? Did they have a planned program? So those are all in the guidebook as well. But I probably won't be talking to them, but they're there for you to read while I'm speaking. So
this is Gary. Could you explain, since it is so important, program
Sure.
profiles are actually in the handbook.
Yes.
And what kind of information is in that profile? I just didn't quite understand.
This is actually it specifically. It's usually these types of bullets. And what it's meant to do is very quickly summarize the distinguishing features of each program without going into depth about how they're all created and how the nuances and the methodologies work as explicitly.
Right.
But then there is an explanation within that description in the larger narrative about how each program sort of unfolds. But I'm sort of focusing on its connection to the phase right now.
Okay, thank you.
No, of course. Next slide. So the next one is the planning and the program concept, and this is really getting at what is our program going to look like, what do we want to achieve, how are we going to get there? And so, what are the basic parameters of the program? What's the geographic scale we're working on? In some cases, that's the jurisdictional boundaries, and in other cases, it's not. Like we said, we've seen everything from a county level down to a city level, down to corridor level, and down to MMTD level. So how is the transit agency involved? In most cases, it's the local governments that are assessing this fee, but at some point, if it's going towards transit projects, you probably want to be talking to your transit agency. And so how does that work? At what point are they involved in the process, and what makes sense? What is the time frame on which the project is based? Particularly with operations, this becomes pretty important. We've seen everything from 1 or 2 years, 3 years, to 20 some odd years to match sort of an LR long-range transportation planning level. The more common was in the 5 to 10 years, which makes it match up with things like capital investment plans, as well as transportation development plans. So that's kind of, you got this like 5 to 10 frame is more common. How will the policy and program be justified and documented? This goes back to the rational nexus discussion, but then also, outlining just how everything's going to work and what, given, your local planning requirements and how your community works on impact and growth management issues, making sure that makes sense. In some cases, people develop mobility plans that just outline very explicitly what this is. In other cases, they've ensured that their policy framework for a mobility fee is developed through existing documentation, and that could be your comp plan and then in subsequent other types of documents. So it just really depends. All of them appear to be working. There have been no court cases that have said none of them are justified, but it's still up in the air about which way maybe is preferred or is best. And then how is the plan or fee adopted? This sort of depends on also how you've chosen to document it. If it's through a comp plan, then that's how it gets adopted. If it's sometimes people have done separate policies. In other cases, they've adopted the mobility plans outright. Next slide. you know, a really big question is how are you going to assess the trips and the cost basis? So the trip basis, these are pretty much the only ways, these are all the ways we've seen from the review of the 20 settlement program. So you could have it by vehicle trips, person trips, vehicle miles traveled, person's mile traveled. We had one example that covered corridor capacity consumed, and then another one that was on based on multimodal level of service. From the cost basis, we have, you sort of have a few different decisions. One is roadway versus multimodal. Some people, by virtue of the fact that they don't necessarily want to get into the multimodal assessments, still just do a roadway one. But others have started to expand that and tried to figure out, like, okay, what's the actual full impact? And then if you decided to go the multimodal route, you can also make the decision about whether or not it's going to be just transit capital or transit capital and operations. You generally, like, once you've made the decision to go multimodal, it does include transit capital, though. We didn't really see any examples where people just sort of stopped with that and only did, like, maybe a bike ped. They pretty much, you either took on multimodal or you didn't. So next slide. Did it go? I have not seen it move. Does anyone else?
Sometimes it takes, because of the internet, a little bit longer. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me freezing up. So I have it in front of me so I could continue to talk even if I can't see it. So the spotlight for this phase was the City of Kissimmee's mobility fee. And one of the best practices that come out of this is that they really spent some time on their program concept, making sure that it would fund transit operations. In their particular case, they have it structured to cover 10 years of operating expenses on their circulator that's going to start this year, I believe. But another thing is that they actually had a pretty strong program documentation across multiple existing planning documents. And this one really emphasizes a program concept around wanting to fund a wide range of desired transportation projects that, although they've identified transit operations as a big part of the immediate, they really wanted a program that was going to give them flexibility. And you can kind of, and it ends up showing in how they've approached it and what, and the specifics, and then where they're ending up, that they were able to do transit operations, which, as I've discussed, is kind of like the tricky one to pull off. Phase 3. Next slide, sorry. So now you've got your program concept, now you've got your plan, you're moving forward. Okay, now you've got to start figuring out fee levels. And overall, basically it's like you have a standard fee, and this is the cost basis divided by the trip basis. One hypothetical example that we kind of had is, the way you might start to build up the cost basis is that you've got the sum of your roadway capacity improvements, you figured out your bike ped improvements, and your transit capital and operations. And maybe you come up with this total of $13.5 million for 15 years. And so that's your cost basis. And then your trip basis, if you did say like the number of trips, is that you might go about doing it where you established a growth scenario in the planning area, you've determined how many trips will result over the planning horizon using that growth scenario with the Institute for Transportation Engineering. Is it engineers or engineering now? I can't remember. The ITE manual to estimate trips. And you might come up with a hypothetical increase of 150,000 trips. And so you put those two things together. In this particular equation, you end up with about like $90 per new trip. And that's a hypothetical that we have just to sort of illustrate how things are going. But then you could also make the decision then is, are there things by virtue of what you're already charging fees for, or, you want to drop the cost for things in the downtown Main Street area. So you could do that. In some cases, it's also recognizing that this money plus maybe another funding source are used together. And so you want to kind of account for that so that and I'll show what that means on the next slide. And then, also if like, oh, yes.
I'm sorry, Kathleen. This is Gary Socolow again.
Yeah.
And I just, I hate to butt in. I sent out a link to the entire audience in their chat box for the entire book that you guys published, because it is really good. and it really does go into not much more detail than you see on the slide. So it's not boring reading, especially what you were talking about, those profiles of the different cities and counties that have done this work. So anyway, I sent out a link to the entire report that was done, and I also would just like to point out one of the things that these mobility fees fit into some of our modern thinking, especially when it comes to complete streets and context sensitive, is that many of the concurrency based strategies were based on, let's develop a community that has no congestion. And this is different. This is, let's build a community that that lives up to our vision of what this community can be, not just spending on the automobile, but also, a full range of strategies to do that. And once we've figured out what our vision is, how do we divide up the costs? And that's really what is in your report. And as I said, when this is through, I highly recommend people look at your full report.
And Gary, this is Chris Wigglesworth. Also, it's important to understand where mobilities allow for a whole range of multimodal funding, toward transit, toward sidewalks, toward bike and ped, where concurrency focused exclusively on roadway capacity. And getting away from the statute that required roadway concurrency, and allows for the option of the mobility fee, gives local governments and local communities more options to do their planning and transportation network differently. Yeah, and so it's kind of important. It's like we're moving away from just requiring roadway capacity in all aspects, but now like giving local governments the option of doing different types of transportation planning based on the multimodal, and also being able to use the mobility fee to help mitigate some of those impacts.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So thank you. Yeah, we're learning and we're growing.
Yeah, that's true.
Sure. So why don't I speed through the last few slides just so everyone can kind of see, and I'm so used to going really fast that I was really trying to slow down, and hopefully I was, but I might have been going then too slow, which has never happened in my entire career. But so shortly on the Ormond Beach, I just wanted to provide some, how they ended up getting to a trip-based fee, is that they kind of took both a land use one and a transportation-based approach, similar to what I talked about, but then they sort of ended up at $66 and $40 and 77.82 trips. And we just really walk through how they do that in this case, because again, on the number 3, it's on methodology and computations, and so there's not it's not as exciting necessarily to talk about. So next phase. Or next slide, I keep on saying that. So administration and collection. And I will say, like, from basically phases 3, 4, and 5, they are much, quicker, easier phases at some point. A lot of the heavy lifting really gets done in phase 1 and phase 2. So you start talking about when and how to collect fees. You have a general fund or a separate transit account. How to communicate the fee effectively. What's the collection process? How does the money change hands over time, just even within organizations? What does that look like with the transit agency? And the one thing that we found that was really, really quite clearly helpful was being able to communicate this to the development community with straightforward instructions, potentially providing preliminary fee estimates, and sometimes taking that one step further with either online GIS tools or maps that basically pre-calculated it for you depending on where your project was. Next slide. And Broward County was really good about this, is that they had a very well-documented approach in which people were able to really understand like how the program was administered. And as a researcher, we thank them greatly for that, because that was helpful. They also were ones that did it as a dedicated fund so that you could really see the transparency behind the revenues and where they went and how they were allocated. Next one. So then you get to this last phase. We're starting to fund projects. So, what projects are funded and how are they prioritized? When we went back and reviewed all of the different lists of projects, you can see on the right, it covers a lot of different things. We have sidewalks, bike paths, bus shelters, transit queue or priority systems, circulators, rail elements, in some cases, strategic intermodal system facilities because they were identified as locally important projects, commuter rail and streetcar. So it's, really quite a wide variety. Understanding how the projects are funded, basically how does it get to whomever needs to be responsible for the money in order to get the project constructed. And the last two are kind of more program evaluation, but like why and how to evaluate the program. One is how is the program working as compared to like its goals? Like, are you getting more transportation funding for different types of projects? But then another one is how is it meeting sort of community objectives? Where does the mobility fee fit into the larger community vision? A little bit what you were talking about, Gary, is like, is it doing that? Because it may be very successful as a fee program and not very successful from a community perspective, which means it's probably not going to last. And then to a certain degree, like when to update the fee, how to do that, those types of things, because it may not always be right the way it is, and you really want to build in a system to like recalibrate it. So next slide. And sort of the good example we have of that is Pasco County, which conveniently is also the oldest, but it's supplemented by a tax increment financing, so they have a system so that it's being sort of evaluated along with that. But at this point, they've been able now to, just to highlight some specific outcomes, increase transit service on State Road 54 and 56, or 54, 56, I guess, and then also new service to the Moon Lake area. They've also funded new parking rides, buses, and shelters. So, they've been able to really take that and go. Next slide. And now we're just going to kind of close out with some of the best practices and the implementation checklist, which is really more something you guys, I recommend just kind of digging into rather than walking through it. So best practices, knowing when to base your fees on VMT versus trip ends. VMT is really better at a sort of a county level, and you'll see it at most jurisdictional levels, but sometimes trip ends is really a good choice too. Depends on how big you're talking about. The cities and maybe neighborhoods and downtown areas, you can get away with trips because it's sometimes easier. For us, the best practice is having the transit supportive improvements in capital and the cost basis and the allowable expenses. But then even one step further is, doing the same with operations. It's sort of like these are both really good things to do because they start to really capture the full cost of the development. Another one is supplementing the mobility fee with other sources of revenue if funding transit services. It's tough to have the mobility fee cover all funding all the time just because it's very much based on what your development activity is. But it can be a really important critical component of that. And we have 8 programs that sort of show how you can do that. But there are examples in which people wanted to do it and weren't able to get it to fund operating, and it's because it was basically exclusively for that service. And it really needs to be part of a funding mix for a transit service usually. Indexing the mobility fees so that inflation doesn't erode its power over time, and then building in a way to update the program of projects every 5 years and updating the fees accordingly. About 5 years seemed to be the right amount to make sure that you could take into account. We saw 3 years, but for smaller communities that might be a little bit difficult. Sometimes it depends on the nature of your development sort of trends. So next slide. And then here's kind of all those questions that we walked through in one easy, handy-dandy checklist, so you can, sit down with it and think about it and write answers and stuff like that. But we thought it was really helpful to kind of see the full world of questions that you really needed to answer in order to have a successful program. And next slide. With that, this is mine and Chris's contact information. More than happy to answer any questions as you dig into it. It's a lot of information. It's kind of dense. It can be a little tricky. A lot of people get tripped up really up front in understanding like how it can fit into their system, and that's where a lot of the questions lie. But once you kind of get past that, the rest of it flows a lot more easily. So, are there other questions, comments, concerns, accolades? I'll take those too.
This is Gary Socolo. I have plenty of accolades. Thank you. That's no, a great talk. And as I said, I sent the link to the report so people could read it It's very good reading. I can't call it entertaining, but entertaining for somebody like myself. I'd also like to point out that in your control panel, as part of this GoToWebinar, you'll see a place that says handouts, and you'll be able to download the handout to this presentation. So all the links that you've seen here will be live on the PDF that you download, but we will also be emailing links to this. And the burning question for me is if either of you had any examples of representative mobility fee from any of the successful places that you've mentioned.
This is Chris Wigglesworth. Yeah, and that's mentioned in several places. We kind of looked into them, and for example, the city of Boca Raton uses the development type to assess mobility fees in the district, and Boca Raton's fee was $40, 71 per trip based on the transportation scenario, and ranged from 28 cents per square foot of light industrial to $2.42 per square foot of retail. And for hotels, they assess $362. The interesting thing about the mobility fee is, as opposed to concurrency, is that for developers, it's a straight up answer, as opposed to the complexity of proportionate share. And proportionate share is a very complex and difficult calculation for a lot of potential developers to make, where the mobility fee is can be a very straightforward approach, giving reassurance about what the costs are to mitigate for impacts.
Okay.
And sort of just as a quick follow-up is that some of the programs are comparable when you start to look at the fees, but sometimes they're not always, and it kind of depends on not just like locations, but sometimes the size of the jurisdiction and the goal of the project or the program, just as an FYI. So, there probably are some peer ones within the 20 or 30 programs nearby, but to sort of talk about them all and just list out the fees, you may not get a very good, set of comparisons.
Yeah. I got another question here from one of our people in the webosphere, and I'm just going to read it here. Can you identify, and this may not be answerable from this report, where mobility fees have later been reduced because they were too costly?
Yeah, actually, so the example that we gave on the phase 4 that I gave the land use, if we go back to that slide, I'm trying to remember. Now I can't remember which jurisdiction it is, right? Isn't that how it always happens? That's what the calculations got you to, Ormond Beach, but that's not actually what they were.
Was it Broward County or?
No, it's Ormond Beach, I think, and it's
Ormond
what it
Beach,
is
okay.
that they actually got reduced to $16. So they reduced them by a significant amount based upon wanting to spur development and being nervous about that. I didn't get into that because that's obviously a political decision, but that is an example of one that was reduced. And that has happened. People are like, well, we're just not prepared to or we feel that, although the calculations are based on, the IT generation manual, and perhaps there are other issues associated with that sometimes communities aren't 100% behind. And as I mentioned earlier, part of some of the reason people weren't always interested in making this change has been that they have a big fear that the fees are going to go up dramatically. And I would say that really just depends on how the program is structured, as it would be with any sort of fee system. You could always increase the fees. That's not really, the question is do you want to, and what kinds of incentives do you want to put out there? So, and it can be dependent upon where the development is too. So.
Yeah, the experience that you're talking about is not a new experience. Even has been experienced in the old style. The impact fees, when we did everything, the profession did everything what we thought was correct And then we told somebody in a county that, well, you know, you're building a home for 200,000, but we calculate that you're going to have to pay 50,000 in impact fees. And even though you can support a rational nexus for it if you want, it's not going to fly.
Yeah.
You can justify it all you want. It's never going to happen. And so reasonableness will always, it's not just politics, but it's also reasonableness, you know, and the difference of what has happened in the past, what people are used to. But as you pointed out, the fact that in mobility fees, once they've been established, you don't have to go through that mathematical magic with all the trips and you know, we think it's going to cost this much per mile, but we're going to have 3 trips that are going to go over someplace else, so we won't trip the you know, some sort of
level of service standard on one road or
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very superior to have something that is known coming in.
Right, and
Well,
and basic, it could boil down to like it's a pay your fee and you go. You know, once all that is established and it's clear in the ordinance or it's clear in the plan, you know, and then you could, there's supporting projects that are identified in either the MPO or the comp plan that that the funds or the fees can be directed to.
And you could also envision a scenario in which certain developers and developments pay less than they would under the current regime.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, I think one of the big things is that if you have a program that's really structured around meeting really specific community goals and maybe that is a compact development, and then it's structured around trying to capture the cost of what we would call sprawl, then you do have the ability to then justify it a little bit more. And you can say, like, yeah, it's a $200,000 house, but you're really dramatically adding on to someone's transportation costs. So it's not as, cheap as you would like to pretend, and there's a cost associated with it, and we're trying to capture that. And that can be a slightly different conversation. It may not still be reasonable, but you're starting to build the policy infrastructure around better decisions when it comes to stuff like that, though, too.
Especially when you can say that, 10 miles closer, there are places that are developable where that same 50,000 will be 10,000 or 2,000. Yeah.
Right, and that's how the fee could be used as a planning tool.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
instead of chewing up available capacity by moving development out into the hinterlands, you're giving everyone a break for making the developments in areas that are already served with services, and so that there's like Pasco County has a buy down program. If you are in certain districts or in certain areas, you get a break, or you might not pay anything. But if you're out where infrastructure has to be put in, it's going to be different. It's going to be potentially more.
Yeah.
And I will say, broadly speaking, because concurrency has been around and those sort of associated impact fees, developers in Florida don't fight about them. They do, that's not fair, but there's an established regime around an impact fee concept that people have been paying for quite some time. And so I think if you go to places where there are no impact fees, or they're very minimal and they're not as common, but that's not necessarily the case in Florida as much, so that conversation can sometimes be also pretty different where, and that's not to say it's 100%. Because there are a lot of examples in which, impact fees were waived at certain points when the economic downturn happened. But their existence is not usually as contested as other things in other communities.
Yeah, really, because there is some definite, there's some assurance that this is how much you're going to pay.
Exactly. So. Gary, looks like we got another question. Do you want me to just read it, or do you want to take it on?
Oh, I think I can do that.
Okay.
Since MMTDs and mixed land use and TODs are being promoted to have a large mode split and internal capture, I'm trying what mode split and internal captures are typically applied to the ITE trip generation. This may be too detailed a discussion. Yes, Debbie, Dan, it is too detailed for what we have right now. But the mode split and internal capture is done on a case-by-case basis, and I know that you, Debbie, have probably experienced and done more studies than most of us here online. And you also know that the ITE has been working on a new trip generation manual, which will have more urban and less concentration on suburban land uses, and that in fact back in 2014 the NCHRP, National Cooperative Highway Research Program, came up with a more refined way to work with internal capture. But no matter how you cut it, Debbie, it is a combination of science and art, and just like fees, reasonableness has to play a role in it too. So that's the best I can do with the time that we have, Debbie. All right.
And I'll just like throw this in in the guidebook, the case study for Ormond Beach mobility fees talks about how Ormond Beach did their methodology in computation to get person trips based on the ITE generation manual.
And Debbie, you did another good question here at the end. In doing large area forecasting, it's cumbersome to do this on a case-by-case basis. My short answer to that is, well, maybe it's worth it for it to be cumbersome. But second, also, is that, yes, there are governments that have done their own studies and have looked at certain kinds of developments and did the analysis and said, well, there's 15% here, and 15% internal capture. So instead of making the next developer who does something like this go through a $200,000 study, we'll allow them up to 15% without a study. I know of some local governments that have done that. All right.
Gary, this looked like Gina put a question just to the
Yeah. So Gina,
okay.
One of our panelists, Gina Bagnani, said developers argue on which trip bases can be used in the calculation. For example, VMT versus PMT, and I will ask our speakers if what they know about that.
Sure. So generally speaking, it's just sort of chosen for them. I don't think I saw an example. I mean, well, there's two answers. One is that usually it's based upon how the program is structured, and that's just how it is. And there might be reasons to pick one versus the other. So, it's not meant to be like as if you get to choose how your trip basis is developed. It's developed on the front end, and then it is what it is. But that being said, one of the nuances that comes up is that really in most cases, it's not all of them, but in most cases, PMT is usually just an extrapolated function of VMT. So like that's still the base. So even if you, in most programs, so even if you did switch between them, it wouldn't make that much of a difference because ultimately the PMT is still based on VMT, and it's usually some sort of factor associated with it. So it's sort of, we say that PMT is a way you could calculate it, but in practice, it really just ends up being a VMT extrapolated number. But you could certainly envision people getting a better handle on determining what PMT would be that wouldn't be that kind of calculation in the future, particularly since there continues to be a lot of development on sort of multimodal performance measures all across at all levels. So you could certainly see that changing over time. But at this point in time, in the programs that we see, I'd say almost exclusively, it's not, you know, it's not something people can argue about, anyways. I mean, oh, well, I guess they could, but they don't. It's like that's like complaining that like someone's using U.S. dollars. Like it is what it is. So.
All right. Well, thank you, and we look like we're running out of time for more questions. And you know, if there are other questions, you will be receiving an email from us with links and things like that, and you will have an opportunity to ask us more questions. And Debbie Danton, thank you so much for your questions, and I appreciate your appreciation of our answers. I'm sorry, I will shut up now. This is.
And this is Chris Wigglesworth again. I want to thank Gary for doing the webinar and giving us the opportunity to present the guidebook. I mean, we wanted to try to get it out there to the communities and consultants and transportation planners and land use planners to kind of give a basis and an overview of what's occurring and what we've found, what's happening with the mobility fees. And Katie Rooney has done a terrific job and has really taken this project fully on. And I've even learned stuff along the way, with all the stuff that we were able to put together. So I really appreciate the work that Renaissance Planning has done, and then with Gary giving us the opportunity to present this on the webinar. And thank you all for joining too.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks.
We really
having two hard questions.
Yeah.
I thought they were pretty difficult. Shoot.
Oh, they'll get harder, I think, as time goes on for everyone.
I know, right?
All right. So, Michael, any closing thoughts, or will I be doing those?
Do you have any more questions, Gary? I think we covered almost everything here.
Yeah, I think so too.
Thank you guys for joining us.
Mm-hmm. And if you have recommendations for future webinar subjects, let us know. And Winston, thank you for your comment. So appreciate it.
Alrighty, at this time we will be closing the webinar. Thank you all for attending.